Imagine struggling to make ends meet, and then the entire economy falls apart. Imagine earning barely enough to survive, and suddenly millions of Americans are out of work, competing for the same jobs. Imagine spending your life shut out of opportunity, only to watch the government launch programs designed to rescue the country. Yet many of those programs still leave you behind. That was the reality for Black Americans during the Great Depression. If you want to understand why the racial wealth gap in America didn't appear overnight, this is where the story begins. Because for countless Black families, the Great Depression wasn't the start of hardship. It was another devastating burden added to generations of hardship that had never really ended. When most people think about the Great Depression, they picture the stock market crash, endless breadlines, banks closing their doors, and men in worn-out coats standing outside factories hoping someone would offer them a day's work. All of that happened. But there's another side of the story that rarely gets the same attention. Long before 1929, many Black Americans were already living on the edge financially. Across the South especially, countless families were trapped in sharecropping, agricultural labor, domestic service, and some of the lowest-paying jobs in the country. Most had little or no savings, no meaningful financial safety net, and no protection against racial discrimination. So when the economy collapsed, they weren't falling from stability. They were already hanging by a thread. If you were a Black man living in a city, you may have finally secured one of the few jobs that employers were willing to give you: hauling garbage, working in a steel mill or foundry, shining shoes, or performing the back-breaking work that others refused to do. Then the Depression arrived. White workers were suddenly desperate too. Jobs that had once been dismissed as Negro work quickly became jobs white workers were willing to fight for. Employers were forced to make choices, and far too often those choices followed a familiar pattern. The Black worker lost his job first. That's where the saying, "last hired, first fired," became a painful reality. For Black women, the situation was often even more limited. Many worked as maids, cooks, laundresses, cleaners, or nannies. When white families began struggling financially, one of the first expenses they eliminated was household help. Overnight, women who had already been earning very little found themselves with no income at all. The situation was even harsher across the rural South. Millions of Black Southerners worked as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, or low-paid farm laborers. Most didn't own the land they farmed. They worked property owned by white landowners, handed over a large share of every harvest, and remained trapped in a cycle of debt that was nearly impossible to escape. Then, agricultural prices collapsed. Cotton, the region's most important cash crop, lost much of its value. Demand dried up. Farming was beginning to change as machinery slowly replaced manual labor. At the same time, Black farmers were still living under the constant realities of the Jim Crow South: violence, exploitation, intimidation, and a system that routinely cheated them out of the little they earned. Picture what that meant. You spend an entire year working land you don't own. You have no control over the financial records. You don't decide what your crops will sell for. And when the season finally ends, you're told you still owe money. That wasn't simply poverty. It was economic captivity. As the Depression grew worse, families that had already been barely surviving were pushed into complete desperation. At its peak, unemployment across the United States reached roughly 25%. That alone was an economic disaster unlike anything the country had ever experienced. But for Black Americans, the numbers were often far worse. In many communities, unemployment approached 50%. In some cities, it climbed even higher. Think about what that looks like. Half the people in your neighborhood are out of work, maybe even more. No regular paycheck, no savings to fall back on, almost no dependable public assistance, and no guarantee that if a job became available, you'd be the one who got it. Pressure like that changes every part of family life. It determines what ends up on the dinner table. It determines whether children stay in school or have to help support the family. It determines whether rent gets paid, whether bills pile up, and whether relationships can survive the constant stress. But this is the part that deserves just as much attention. Black families did not simply give up. They adapted. They made every dollar stretch rich as far as possible. Multiple generations crowded into small apartments and aging tenement buildings. Families shared kitchens, bathrooms, beds, meals, childcare, and whatever resources they had. They bartered goods and services. They relied on churches. They relied on neighbors. Most of all, they relied on one another. Then Franklin Roosevelt introduced the New Deal. On paper, it promised hope, jobs, public works projects, relief programs, unemployment assistance, and the largest federal effort to fight economic suffering that America had ever attempted. And to be fair, some Black Americans did benefit from parts of the New Deal. Some Black Americans did find opportunities through federal work programs. Others gained employment through government-funded projects that supported artists, musicians, and writers. Young Black workers, who had previously been shut out of many careers, were finally able to access job training and new employment opportunities. There were even influential Black advisors working closely with President Franklin Roosevelt, urging his administration to confront racial inequality more directly. But there was a major problem. Many of the New Deal's most valuable programs were administered by local governments, especially in areas where Jim Crow laws still shaped everyday life. Other programs were structured in ways that excluded large numbers of Black workers from the very beginning. That's where the deepest damage was done. Because a policy doesn't have to mention race to produce unequal outcomes. If a law appears race-neutral, but leaves out the occupations where Black Americans make up a large share of the workforce, the result is still racial inequality. That's exactly what happened. Many agricultural laborers and domestic workers were excluded from important labor protections and from the earliest Social Security benefits. These weren't small groups of workers. They represented some of the largest sources of employment for Black Americans across the country. As many white families began gaining access to programs that helped create long-term financial security, millions of Black families were left without the same opportunities. Decisions like these don't just affect one generation. Their consequences can last for decades. But once again, Black Americans refused to accept those barriers without a fight. They organized, they protested, they documented discrimination, they launched boycotts, they created advocacy organizations. They demanded jobs, equal treatment, and a fair chance to participate in the country's recovery. Rather than waiting for change, they worked to force it. Campaigns like "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" encouraged Black consumers to withhold their spending from businesses that welcomed Black customers but refused to hire Black employees. Black leaders continued pressing the federal government to do more. Educators and civil rights advocates like Mary McLeod Bethune helped establish what became known as the Black Cabinet, a group of influential Black advisors who worked with the Roosevelt administration to make New Deal programs more responsive to the needs of Black communities. Writers, activists, labor organizers, ministers, and ordinary working people all became part of that movement. And that's one of the most important lessons from this period in American history. When the system failed to protect Black Americans equally, Black communities organized, mobilized, and applied enough pressure that the system could no longer ignore them.